All right, everybody. Welcome to the 10 o'clock session. Great to have you all here. We're going to be realizing the economies of scale through modular housing. We're going to explore how modular housing can help with producing affordable homes and achieving economies of scale through this. We're going to have some great speakers for you today. Jeff Lubell from ABT Global, Grace Kim from Schemata Workshop, and Aaron Holm from Patient Circle. And with that, I'd like to start off with Jeff. Take it away.
Thanks, Dietrich. Good morning, everyone. Let's try that again. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
All right. Dietrich's already urged you to move forward, and I just want to thank you very much. It's, when you teach, everybody always sits in the last row, right? And I always want to take away the first row, but then they'll just keep moving back and back even further. What we're going to do today is we're going to have a conversation, and we're going to start with a conversation up front, and then we're going to leave lots of time for you all to participate in that conversation. I hope you don't mind. We're not going to show any PowerPoints. You've seen, I think, probably enough PowerPoints to last you a lifetime, but happy to share more information afterwards if you're interested. And what we're going to do is we're going to have some brief introductions, and then I'm going to give a little framing. Then we're going to have a conversation up here, and then we're going to open it up. And when we open it up, we'd ask that you come up to the microphones if you want to participate, just so everybody can hear you really well. So let's start with introductions. Grace, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure.
Oh, yes. This is being recorded, so you can... Oh, there was a live feed up there, but just so you know. Please go ahead, Grace.
Okay. Great. So I'm Grace Kim. I'm an architect and one of the owners of Schemata Workshop. We're an architecture firm in Seattle. And I've been in the affordable housing space for a long time, 20 plus years, and have also worked in modular and have completed projects using modular, volumetric modular construction. Have designed many that never got to that point, but we always start off projects with that in mind. So I'm also a member of the, HDC's executive board. I'm their vice president, so I'm happy to be here on that in that capacity as well. We have an off-site construction task force that has been looking at modular construction for many years now.
Great. Aaron?
Yeah, I'm Aaron Holmes, so I run an advisory firm called SomaPath. I grew up with a single mom in a very low-income environment, so I was really riveted to the speaker who was opening the session. I've spent 20 years building companies, most of them in the technology space, a lot around digital photography. None of this makes any sense, but digital photography. Built 2 companies in New York City, 1 company in Bellevue, and then I spent a few years at Amazon working on built environments, so the cashierless grocery, and then we launched the bookstore, and then I had this crazy light go off around productization and manufacturing, so I created a company called Blockable in 2016, and then we ran that for about 8 years, had 2 factories in Vancouver, Washington, built projects in Washington, California. One of our buildings is at the National Renewable Energy Lab. 6 years ago, I had a heart attack and a quintuple bypass, which was very eye-opening for me. So kind of, changed my perspective on a lot of things, which is why I'm telling you about myself personally. And then now I work with companies who are building really innovative products, whether they're starter home products or multifamily products, who I believe have a path to manufacturing and substantially reducing the cost to build, which in my view is the primary cost. If you can change the cost inputs, you can change a lot of the different variables. So yeah, that's what I'm up to.
Great, thank you, Grace, and thank you, Aaron. So I'm Jeff Lubell, and first of all, apologize for the mask. I have a vulnerable daughter, so I'm just trying my best to not bring COVID home, but I'll try to speak up as best as possible So I work at a company called Apt Global. It used to be known as Apt Associates. We are a research and consulting firm. I live in Vermont. It was took a little while to get over here yesterday via Dallas. But I'm excited to be here. I've been working in this space for over 25 years. I've been at Apt for 11 years. I'm a principal associate for housing and asset building there, where I work on research and technical assistance projects. Before that, I ran the Center for Housing Policy in Washington, D.C., and I was the director of the Policy Development Division at HUD in their Office of Policy Development and Research in Washington. So I'm really excited about this. I think this is the topic of our times, or at least one really important one. So I'm going to give a little bit of framing, and then we've got some questions for our panelists, and then we'll get you all involved. So you don't need me to tell you this, but we're living through an incredibly intense period of rising construction costs that are contributing to rising home prices and rising rents. So we need innovations in home construction now more than we ever have before. Now, manufactured housing, the development of housing in factories using the HUD code, has achieved significant economies of scale. They produce quality homes at lower costs, and it's an important source of affordable housing in much of the country. The cousin to manufactured housing is modular construction, which in theory promises to apply similar processes to produce lower cost homes that look just like stick-built homes. So we all know what a manufactured home looks like, but nobody knows what a modular home looks like, because it can look exactly like your home. It could be multifamily, it could be single family, it can be a duplex, a triplex, a quadruplex, a garden style apartment, you name it, right? Okay, so modular housing has a lot of potential, and I think there are a lot of advantages to modular housing over stick-built homes that we'll talk about. But I think it's fair to say that it has not realized the full potential that we hope it would have realized by now to really bring down the cost of construction. Every panel I've ever been on this topic, someone will stand up, and you're welcome to do it, and it's totally fine. And they will say, I've gotten a quote for modular, and it wasn't much different than stick-built, right? And that makes complete sense, because if you are asking for a custom build, essentially, and we're treating modular as a series of custom builds, then everything's a one-off project, right? You can't set up your systems to really achieve the kinds of economies of scale and the kinds of mechanization that you really need to lower costs. And so what we want to talk about in this session is a different way of thinking about, ultimately, about modular. Not something that, yeah, it lets you build year-round, that's great, it lets you assemble faster, that's great. But how do we actually lower costs? And to do that, we need to think differently about the manufacturing process than we have in the past. And we also need to think differently about this issue of risk. So, right now, the companies that set up plants, they bear all the risk, right? So if interest rates go up and people stop buying, what are they going to do? They've invested all this money, and they can't pay their staff. They have to lay everybody off. That's it, right? You're out of business. The same thing happened during the pandemic. There were businesses here in Washington that really suffered during the pandemic, right? Because people weren't buying anymore. And you can go back to the great housing recession and see the same thing, right? And so we need to think differently about risk too, because at the end of the day, there's still a demand for housing, even though interest rates go up, right? And so there ought to be a way to really realize that demand. Maybe we need to lower the cost of those homes. We need to find a different way to finance those homes. But if we lay all the risk on the manufacturers, we're going to get what we have now. We're going to get boom and bust cycles. People get really excited about it. When the prices go up, all of a sudden, boom, there's a stop. They fall out of business. And we're like, why don't we have a plant that's working? Right? So we need to talk about risk, and we need to talk about standardization. So those are two themes. We're going to come back to some ideas about how to do that. But first, I'd really like to just hear a little bit from the panelists. So, Aaron, in our discussions, You've talked about a difference between off-site construction and the manufacturing of homes and factories. Can you tell me a little bit more about this distinction?
Sure. Well, it's sort of it's the distinction between projects and products. So it's the difference between it's kind of the thing that you said about what's the price per square foot. So construction and manufacturing are very different disciplines and processes. They have different costs, different people work in those industries. What it takes to actually set up manufacturing is very different than what it takes to build a project. The way the industry typically functions, everything is built around the logistics and a site. So what can we build on the site? What's it going to cost to build on the site? Who's going to build it? How do we get it through the regulatory process? What's the financing, et cetera? Everything's very project focused. Manufacturing can't work that way. Real manufacturing requires a repeatable process and product to build over and over and over and over again. So the manufacturing in the housing world has really kind of been cut off at things like windows and doors and components and inputs that go into the construction process. So if you look at what construction does, is construction builds projects. What manufacturing does is manufacturing builds products. And what we've been in for the last maybe 50 years has been in this cycle of off-site construction, which is about as far as it's gone so far, which means you can take elements of the framing process of a building and you can move them into an indoor setting and into a factory, and then you can arbitrage labor and arbitrage material. But where that gets you to is essentially what Jeff was saying earlier, which is on a bid basis, if I'm running an off-site construction plant and I'm going to bid on a project, my material cost, my labor cost, my overhead cost, my machines, all of that will get me to the point where I'm probably going to price it to the same as what it costs in the market, but I can do it faster. So the value proposition is we can build in less time, which saves capitalized interest. That's the state of the art for modular for the last 50 years. The issue with that is it's very difficult to finance a company that's going to create that kind of a business model. So even if you look at McKinsey's industry-leading research on this subject, if you dig into it, the manufacturer is not a manufacturer, it's an off-site construction company, and B, it's not really financeable because it's creating 10, 15% margins on a project-by-project basis. Investors who are going to put money into someone building a factory to do off-site construction are not going to see significant returns back to the order of being able to finance something meaningful. So it creates a difficulty. Manufacturing, this is a long answer, but it is what it is. Manufacturing is the answer, meaning the economies of scale and what are called the learning effects of manufacturing hold in them the latent possibility to substantially reduce costs, which is the core issue. So if you can, it's similar to the Model T, the old Ford analogy, like Henry Ford creating. It wasn't the fact that he set up a factory and started building on the assembly line. It was the fact that he stopped changing the product. Other people were building in the factory. Other people were building cars in the factory. But what they hadn't figured out was the efficiencies were to be gained at getting better and better and better at manufacturing. If you look at we did a study with the National Renewable Energy Lab on this subject. There are double-digit cost reductions available in the learning effects of manufacturing by getting good at building the same thing over and over again. But it means that you control the product and you control the process. That's important because when you look at the new housing that's going to be coming online, it needs to be more energy efficient, it needs to be more resilient. These things are added costs that can be borne in the learning effects. So there's actually 7% lower costs of developing housing that is energy efficient. So all that is to say, manufacturing as a process requires stability and a product being locked and something that they can build over and over again, which typically requires a prototyping phase, which means you're going to go and you're going to prototype a product for multiple years. And in this industry, that's not something that's been done. So what's missing is there's this gap between indoor construction, which industrialized construction, and advanced manufacturing, which requires multiple years of short-run prototyping, which is an industry that does not exist in housing.
Great, thanks, Aaron. So I'm going to consolidate some of the questions here just so we can get to the audience. But Grace, if you could What are, in your view, what are some of the main advantages to manufacturing, housing, and factories the way we're talking about?
I think the main advantage of that would be to, I guess going back to what both of you actually said, standardization and sort of production. If we could get to that point, we could bring down costs. I think right now, as you said, if any of us, architects, developers, whomever, go in and price out a project, the cost of constructing a modular project is the same as site built. And in some cases, the actual cost of the module might be cheaper, but when you have to truck it across from Idaho or from California, that trucking cost then offsets and becomes the comparable cost. And so that's not something that is feasible, or on a one-off situation it might be. But I think the advantage, once we can get to the productization of homes, and I say that from the standpoint, there's, for the architects in the room, raise your hand if you're an architect. If you look at my set of plans, or your set of plans, or your competitor's set of plans, if there's a one-bedroom unit or a two-bedroom unit in that plan set, I'm pretty sure you have one in your office that's exactly the same, right? So we continue to reinvent sliced bread when the bread that's being served out of the box is fine. And granted, all buildings aren't rectangles, but if we can get to the point where we, as an industry, could agree when we have a one-bedroom, a studio, a two-bedroom that are in the middle of the building, let's just use the same building blocks, right? If we can agree to that, then I think we can start to get some economy of scale, and that we can start to get plants to say, yes, we can do that, and we'll build product A, B, and C, and you can pick one of those, and if you use those, then here's the price, and it's an easy thing to imagine. But if we're gonna be the architects that are saying, we're gonna design the best one bedroom, and this building's gonna be better than the next, we're wasting our time, and we're wasting design energy. And if we can do this as an industry and get contractors on board, then I feel like we can actually deliver more housing for less cost.
Great. I remember in our planning conversation, you said something also about the workforce and the kinds of people that would be employed in a manufacturing process. Can you just say that for the folks here?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've seen as I've toured factories on the East Coast, mostly in the US here, so when I think about the job sites that I go visit, there's a lot of dudes on site, and they're often larger than me. And when I go to factories, what I notice is that there are women, my size or smaller, that are operating machinery, because when there's a big wall panel, there's not 6 guys trying to lift it. There's a person with a button on a cord, and it's moving the assist, right? Whatever assist to lift up the panel, to move the panel, push it down the line. There are ways that people that are of much smaller stature can be employed in construction. Likewise, there's some jobs that could be done seated, and they're repetitive, and so you can train people that might have a developmental disability or somebody that has a mobility issue. Those are other people that are currently not employed in the current construction industry. And that's a big deal right now, because as busy as we are, we're limited and constrained by the number of people that can work in the field. And that number is going down with the boomers retiring, and with us focusing more on college and not on vocational education. So we just have a labor shortage. So if we could expand the market, there's still going to be plenty of jobs for the construction workers, but there's going to be an expanded workforce that can then also help us reduce cost.
Great, thanks, Grace. Aaron, I'm going to consolidate 2 questions here. If you could just talk a little bit about what are the main obstacles to moving from offsite construction to more of a manufacturing process, and how do we overcome those obstacles?
Well, the obstacles are it's not the way that it's done. The incentives are all different, and who drives the process will change. So the way that offsite construction is typically purchased is as a construction input into a development process, which means it's usually quoted as a line item or several line items in a construction budget. So it might be the framing, maybe it's 10, 15, 20% of the overall budget. So the way that it's purchased, the questions are very different. If you're an offsite construction company, you're bidding your product, you know the product cost in the market, and you also know what all the other factories are bidding at, because developers are coming to you and saying, what's your price per square foot? That's the question. That's really the only question that they have. So what's your price per square foot? if you're manufacturing, you've already spent, and the thing is, you can start an off-site construction factory, open up your doors with not, you can cost some money, it depends on how solid your pipeline is, but you can set it up to build pretty much what the industry builds. So you can build wood, you could build steel, but a lot of times it comes down to, you're bidding basically what's your price per square foot. Manufacturing takes significant investment up front on a product development process and a prototyping process and an assembly prototyping process. So you're doing two things at the same time. You're developing and engineering a product that is for a specific market. So you're building starter homes, or you're building garden multifamily, or you're building 5-over, or you're building high rises. These are all very different products from a product perspective in terms of their capabilities. So there's millions of dollars up front in product innovation, and at the same time, you're also engineering the manufacturing process. So how are you going to build these? So you need upfront capital, tens of millions of dollars, to invest to the point where now you're ready to go out and build projects, and then you need multi-year partnerships with developers that are going to scale up with you as you do it. But when you get to this place, you're not bidding on a price per square foot anymore. It's not, you can't, that model, you've gained so much efficiency and importance in the process, and you've defined so much of the architecture and the engineering and everything that's in the building, that your process to build a project is very different than a traditional process. So what's missing in general is there's a few gaps in capital. So there's a gap in capital for growth capital. You can raise early money on an idea to build out a new type of building system, and people will finance that generally. Right now, there's a huge gap in what I would call Series B capital, which means you've proven out a product and now you're ready to kind of scale it up and grow it. There's a big hole in the market because of interest rates over the last few years. And then on the incentive side, it needs developers who understand the longer-term vision of being able to build a repeatable product and drive down costs in a very specific market segment and want to be able to participate in that over multiple years. They're not just looking to build one project. And on the government side, it's a shift towards performance-based review so that we're not always, having to re-engineer and rethink every project, but we know that we can have approvals for what we're building, and that there are incentives for by-right development for the asset class that we're building so that we don't run into, because there's so much that you have to de-risk in order to bring up a manufacturing organization, that piling development risk on top of that gets almost unfeasible. So if manufacturers want to be working in places where the government has tried to clear the way for whatever type of housing they're building to be done by right in a very predictable and de-risked fashion.
Great, thanks. Grace, thoughts about how to overcome obstacles to shift towards more use of modular construction?
I think I think one of the big things is market acceptance. I think right now modular has a tainted perception. There's a lot of folks that think modular is manufactured homes or a mobile home, right? And they don't understand, because, as Jeff said, it's not like you can point to something and say that's a modular, volumetric modular home. It doesn't look any different. I think that there have been, as a country, Americans have been looking at and enamored by offsite construction and manufactured homes for the last 100 years. And it started around in World War II when we deployed a bunch of guys overseas and they were building Quonset huts to live in. That started a manufacturing process or an idea so that when those guys came back and they went to their farms and whatever little villages or towns that they were living in, they were like, oh, I could figure out how to build that in a day by myself. And so they scaled it up, and that's what a lot of the warehouses and the factory or the farm sheds and things like that are made of. When you drive across the US, you can see these things scattered across the country. And since that time, there have been blips where there was a movement of mid-century modern homes. A lot of those were sort of kit homes. The Sears Roebuck home, even before that, that you see craftsman homes around the country that people love. Those are kit homes that were built out of factories. So there's been this constant interest. And even, I was saying to Erin, even, a decade ago, Michelle Kaufman was at this conference talking about modular homes because the Dwell House, or the Glide House and the Breeze House that Sunset Magazine had been advertising, they were catching on. So, but every time these little blips of like, oh, maybe this is the moment that it's gonna flip, and then there's like a major recession or something happens in our industry that just shuts things down. So we had a major factory that was all set up with robots and machines from Europe that had opened up just before the housing, or before the recession in 2004 or 7 or something like that. It was right around the time we started our company. So I feel like if we could get the general population to get on board with modular, to want to consume modular construction, I think that's a big factor for us, because the banks are like, ooh, modular, that sounds weird. Can you drive that away on a, is it on a chassis? There's not an understanding because the general marketplace doesn't understand it. So that's one thing. And then I'll just make the next part brief. I think that we also need to be thinking about how do we streamline the process. As you said, it's not helpful for a company to be second guessing or trying to like get each of the modules approved. So if we can get, in Washington State alone, if we could get all of the jurisdictions to agree on what would be a standard for building modular homes for multifamily or for middle income or missing middle, like townhouses and things like that, a more smaller scale, then it would help us all, because it's not helpful that a project in Bellingham is built to a different standard than in Bellevue or different standard than in Battleground, just because the local codes are different. And so that's a big challenge that we have to overcome, is how do we get over that?
That's a great point I wanted to expand on. Which
Briefly.
Is, if you look at other markets, Japan, Sweden, markets where there's a high degree of modular building, there tends to be a federal system for codes. And so the government says this is allowed. It's allowed everywhere. If it meets these performance guidelines, then it's approved. And if you're a plant, that's what you want to hear. You're like, okay, so you're saying if I build this thing, it's always okay.
Yeah, and
that's literally all you want. You just want to be able to say that I know, because the strangest thing with setting up a factory is you can create the most incredible product, the most cost-efficient product. It's like a spaceship. It's beautiful. Everybody loves it, and you can build 10,000 of them, and it'll be illegal to put them anywhere. You can create this incredible process, but if you don't flow that into how real estate is financed and governed and reviewed, and from a regulatory process, they're just going to sit in the yard.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I want to introduce a few concepts here that I think can be helpful. I mean, this is a big topic, right? And it can get really overwhelming to think about how to move forward. And I would encourage us to think differently about two different scales. One scale is, how can we build 200 lower cost homes a year, right? 200, 400, whatever number you want, but just almost, it's like a large demonstration, but actually would make a big difference, right? And the other scale is, how do we change the marketplace so that we could unleash this power, for everyone, right? And those are two very different questions, and they need different solutions. I mean, there's some overlap, but they're related, right? So when it comes to like, how do we build 200 homes a year? I mean, if you could offer a manufacturer, you could say, we will promise to buy 200 homes a year for 3 years or 4 years. I don't know what the exact number is, but you give them some guarantee, right? And you say, but I want a huge discount, right? I firmly believe that you would be able to attract a manufacturer to do that, because you've eliminated their pipeline risk, right? You've essentially said, we're going to buy those units, and they can set up their manufacturing plants for that specific type of unit. It would have to be a very limited number you're not talking about everything custom. It would have to be a product. And it would also give them a foothold in the marketplace that could then allow them to expand and offer other things, and scale up. So thinking about a pre-buy agreement as a way to both get homes in the ground and actually, sooner rather than later, move forward with this, I think is one idea that's really worth thinking about. You obviously need a distribution mechanism, so we need to think about what are we going to do with those homes once they're built? How do we make sure there's market acceptance for them? How do we, so you can't just do this in the abstract. It has to be done in coordination with whoever's going to distribute those homes. And then on the market side, I would focus on some of the things that Aaron and Grace were talking about. We need a standard set of building codes, right? And make sure the zoning is appropriate so that you could build this and install this statewide. And we also need to think about what are we going to do to protect them during the downturn, right? Because inevitably there's going to be a downturn, right? And so do we want that factory to go out of business? Is that a good thing? Or can we say, you know what, we're going to give them a fallback. If there's a downturn, some entity will agree to buy the price at a discount so they can at least, keep the factory going and wait until it opens up again. And in the meantime, you buy a lot of homes at below market levels that you can distribute to the people who need them, right? And so, again, both of these require entities to assume some risk, but it's really not a huge risk, right? Because if you've done your homework and there's a market for this, and it's done in coordination, right? Close coordination with a distribution network, and that's essential. I think we could really kind of make a difference and start moving along both of these dimensions. So wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
I don't think that that's a big lift for our state. I mean, in Washington state, when there is a downturn, affordable housing continues to go. I think I know there's a contractor in the room for that reason. So that is something that we can, like, regardless of whether the market is up or down, we can always be guaranteeing that. And I think for our state, 200 units is nothing. That's a project. So and I'm going to say this, I might get my hand slapped later, but there are funders in this room. So if Commerce or Wishvik wanted to say, we're going to dedicate 200 boxes, not $200,000 or not $2 million, but to say we're going to guarantee 200 boxes and we're going to assign them to different developers or a developer, that's an easy thing. And so I think that's an easy step that we could make today, and we don't have to look outside of our area for modular vendor. There are companies in the state, they're not working at this scale today, but in the next year we could easily get them. And Aaron, you might disagree with that, but there are folks that are willing and interested in doing this. And so if there is an interest to move forward with this, we can start today and be looking at boxes in the next year or two and have those placed in service.
Great. Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, the first, when when the music stops, it's always the factory that doesn't have a chair to sit down in. So that's the problem. I think that at the core of it, there are good elements to that proposal. I think my thought would be to structure it slightly different. I'm most interested in the product innovation side of it, and I know that there are a number of companies across the country who have reached sort of that critical point at which they've built prototypes, they've got a good solution, and now they're looking at, okay, what are our markets for this? Are we going to be in a single market? Are we going to expand nationally? Is it a hub and spoke system for the manufacturing? Like, how are we going to do this? Excuse me. So I think that there need to be a few different elements to that. I think 200 is a good number for the first few years of someone setting up a plant. That's a good number. The first year, like, it's enough to hire, set up equipment, and get your first articles moving through a process so that you understand really what you're building. There's a lot to do there. You don't just turn a factory up and it's cranking out homes the next day. So over a 2 to 3 year period as a factory, what you want is you want your capacity to be bought out for 3, 4, or 5 years. You want to know that all things being equal, you have backstop guarantees that if you do your part of it, your finances will make sense and your investors will get paid back, because investors put in money based on future cash flow. So they're expecting there to be cash flow on the other side of it that either your debt or your equity is getting paid back with. So I would tweak it a bit where I think to add to that, you need to have, if the government's going to say we'll backstop this and we'll give 200 homes, there should be a performance requirement around it. It should say they need to be energy efficient, they need to meet this code, they need to have a certain useful life, they need to be whatever the specs are, but not say how. So don't tell the companies how to do it. Just say these are the performance targets that we want to hit. If you hit these targets, the rest of it's out of the way. We're not going to have, it's not going to be L&I doing all the inspections. It's going to be, no, if you give us the engineering and you meet these specifications, we're going to allow you to build these. And then there needs to be, the developer part of it needs to be aligned and along for the ride as well, because they have the pipeline of dirt. So it's probably, in that case, it's a not-for-profit developer program. They've got their sites lined up, but they are technically and financially aligned with the manufacturing process. It's not just a race to the bottom for what's the lowest price per square foot. If the factory has to absorb the losses as it's bringing up its factory and hitting the market cost, they need to know that there's a way for them to recover those losses.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The only quibble I would say is I think there needs to be inspections. There needs to be somebody inspecting the quality of those units. So
that's fine, but when you, yeah. I'll tell you, when you build in a factory, you have to be so precise and repeatable that the number, when folks from either NTA or LNI or any of these entities that inspect these buildings, when they come to a real factory that's set up with any type of, advanced process, they see a level of repeatability that's beyond what you would see on a site. And so it's very predictable, and you can actually reform process based on that.
But those factories also, like when you look in Europe and Asia, those factories have inspectors because they're trying to meet a standard. And if that factory does not meet that standard, that is what actually the factory is afraid of. If they don't meet that standard, then they can't keep going. So there are inspections that happen regularly, sometimes unscheduled, but that ensures the quality is there. At the factory level, so that as consumers, as the developers or the funders, you can be guaranteed that the product is a good quality product, that there's nobody shortchanging things or doing things that are not, good construction practices.
Yeah, and the factory pays for that. So the factory pays for full-time folks to be at the plant doing reviews. The more volume that they have, it's just a cost of it. It's fine, but the quality's definitely manageable.
Okay. Great. So we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Would encourage you to come up to the mic. I'm going to start with a question that was submitted via the app, and then we will. I'm going to put a second mic down there. But the question is, can you speak to construction financing? When Mercy Housing did a large modular project in San Francisco, they had to get a massive philanthropic loan because commercial lenders wouldn't take construction period risk. For example, if the factory went bust, they were worried about finishing work in progress. Can either of you speak to construction financing?
I'll start. So the project that we took to construction or to completion, a housing authority in our area took that on. They didn't have that risk so much, but they had the risk, or they had to put up the money. So a modular factory usually needs to have about half of the cost up front to do the engineering and then procure all the material. Because they can't wait when their production line is going, they can't wait for, we're out of wood, the lumber company needs to now transport the wood. They buy all of it up front. And so that's a big cost, and that's a cost that our funders currently don't know what to do with. When typically, and especially for HUD projects, they don't even like having materials stored off-site. So the fact that you would pay a deposit that is like a third of the overall construction contract, right? So we need to figure that part out.
Yeah, so it's a problem and an opportunity. Conventional construction debt is not the answer, because construction debt doesn't think that way. They think down on draws and risks. And so, as Grace was mentioning, as a factory, you need to buy out all your materials, A, at the right time, at the right cost, but then B, it's all going into a process that happens up front. That's also an opportunity for other types of lenders to be able to put in financing, because the interest rate is less important and it's such a short period of time that you need to deal with that there's opportunities for financing there, and that's where the government should be stepping in. But there's also, to backdrop it, but there's also another level of it, which is the lenders are also looking at, what's my risk if the project has to stop and doesn't get completed? What can I take back? What can I own? And in modular, there's actually an incredible opportunity there where the buildings can kind of go anywhere. If you've standardized the buildings sufficiently to the point where you're not building for a project, you're building your modules, and then the project's kind of decided at the end of the process. That means that you have assets on the floor that if something goes south with the project can easily be redeployed. That's just a model that needs to be considered. It's not very sophisticatedly considered right now, but it will be as this continues to grow.
Right. And certainly if there was a pre-buy agreement that would assist with financing, you could raise a lot of money based on that. Please.
Yes. Hi, Grace. Grace, Aaron, Jeffrey, thank you for this topic. I'm the government in the room. I work for City of Seattle Office of Housing. So I don't do codes. I'm not SDCI, but Question specifically about Seattle and a more general question. So I'm aware of one building, large high-rise 303 battery, right? So I'm curious if you have any thoughts and comments on how that went and how that, I guess the questions we have over in our offices when, how is it different? How is it going to last as long as you probably already know. The question I had specifically is, you mentioned inspections at the factory. What I'm trying to grasp is, how do you inspect it at a factory? But at a factory, it may pass all the benchmarks. But when you put it together on a site, shouldn't it be inspected again as put together? And in that case, that's double inspections. So how does that work? Does it who does the inspections and things like that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the law is pretty clear. What gets built in the factories are governed by the state, and what happens on site is governed by the local officials. Okay. So all of this stuff is well considered and is well known. So it's not fuzzy. California, I think, does a very good job in this aspect, where they've actually come out and said, the state is going to take an active role and actually help manufacturers and offsite builders have more predictability in their process. They proactively go out to the municipalities and they educate them, and they say, look, if you get a project and there's a factory built component, here's how it works. Here's what the state does, here's what we'll guarantee, here's what we're standing behind, here's what our third-party engineers will be reviewing, and here's what's your scope. And they make very clear to them how that'll work. So it's an education process largely, but because of the way the laws work, what's built in the factory is governed by the state, which means the state has to take an active role in educating municipalities about what their scope is and what they can and cannot say yes and no to, because it's also critical for the factory to know what they're up against and what they're going to have to hit in terms of reviews.
But if you want to see the sister project to 303 Battery, DESC has it. It's called Burbridge Place. It's 124 units of the same manufacturing as 303 Battery, and I can tell you how everything was permitted and processed. Look me up.
What is it called again?
It's DESC Burbridge Place.
DESC Burbridge Place. I'm just repeating it for the audience and for the recording, I guess. So 303, any comments on that or anything, Grace?
I'm not sure, is 303 the project that was built maybe like 10, 15 years ago, or are you talking about?
Like past year got
then
TCO,
I
I
can't
think.
speak to that.
I know the project. I'm not going to say anything about it. I mean, there's crazy things happen in this type of stuff, and so I know the project. I know it took a long time. I know it ran through a very difficult financial period and had difficulty with the financing aspect of it, but I don't know enough of the details to comment.
And I would just say that one of the challenges with modular is that there are very few that happen every year. And so it's this kind of microscope that we look at every project that's modular. If we did this with construction, like on-site construction, there are many projects, like countless projects that get built every year that have problems. And we don't study them under the same microscope. So I just want to caution, it's easy to look at any given project and find a gazillion mistakes because people are involved and we're all human, right? So I just give you that caveat. I'm sure that there's problems, but there's problems on every project.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
So what we're going to do is we're going to alternate, thank you, with the questions that I'm getting through the app. So I'm just going to ask one here. And if we could keep our answers brief, we're going to try to get to everyone's question. No commitment, is that what you said?
I said I'm no good at it. I could try.
With this offsite manufacturing model, how can developers both respond to local needs and conditions, such as amenities, green space, or accessibility, given the standardized nature of the process? And how does this process take into account the diversity of utility systems and what it may take to connect the homes to the system?
Factory's got to figure that out. So the product has to know the market that it's building into, and it has to know that these are primary issues. There's stuff that's built off-site and stuff that's built on-site. You can standardize both. You can standardize elevators. You can standardize common spaces, amenities. All that stuff can be standardized. It gets built into the building system. So that's on the product maker to know that in this market where I'm going to be building, I fully understand utilities. I understand all the codes. I understand energy. Like the product has to meet all of those requirements. And then there's the element of, okay, well, what doesn't get built on site? And that means the developer needs to understand those requirements and how those are going to work.
And it doesn't mean that 100% of the building is built in the factory. It could be that 80% is built in the factory. Not all sites are rectangular. So there's going to be the weird corner unit, the unit where the building jogs and there's an L shape. So there's going to be other unit types that are not built in the factory because it might not make sense. Or maybe that product is not available. So I think that in common spaces and other things, I feel like when architects or others are worried about sort of sterile designs or designs that are not joyful or beautiful, I don't think modular is modular is not the problem. It's the architects or the developers limiting the architects. That's the problem. So let's not point point fingers at modular as the reason for that.
Hello. I work with 15 governments in Pierce County, so I'm also a government representative in the room. And so I appreciate some of the stuff you've already said about how governments can be a good partner. I'm wondering if you have any examples of governments or in Washington or around the country that have been like good partners and working on facilitating this. And also if you can say any more about specific like manufacturers or efforts in Washington that like governments could partner with.
In Washington, currently, no. I'm not aware of many manufacturers. I know that there are people who are building. So from a government perspective, I would kind of split it into, like Spokane, for instance, has done some amazing things about reforming development process for missing middle and multifamily. I mean, they've done some really cool work. I'm really curious about what is it that establishes the conditions for a city council to suddenly become very reform-based and make some really positive changes. I think that's a really cool problem. Across the country, you know, Minneapolis has done good stuff in a similar way, but that's all sort of zoning and entitlements and getting all the stuff up front. I'd say that LA right now, to me, is probably the epicenter of where there's a lot, the most companies that I know that are working actively on doing modular product and manufacturing are active in LA because they've had such a rough time over 10 years figuring out how they're going to address affordability.
I will say that in February I was on a tour with HUD over on the East Coast, and there are some amazing factories there. There's a company called Blueprint in the Maryland, D.C. area that is doing a lot of construction, and they consider themselves as a super sub. They while they deliver modular pieces and they'll put together the whole kit in the factory, they deliver them as panels flat. Their equivalent of L&I comes to the factory and just does all of the inspection. There's an agency over in a public agency in Virginia, and if you contact me later, I can try to look up the business card. That there's an agency that is helping to. It's a governmental agency that is helping to demystify modular construction for the general public, for public agencies, and helping them partner and match or find modular vendors to work with. I would say in Washington State there are about 5 vendors that are doing some version of modular. Whitley Evergreen does a lot of school portables and construction trailers. They are very interested in getting into housing. There is a company called Green Canopy Node. They were on tour yesterday. They're working to try to bring modular to the marketplace. Theirs is a slightly different model. And then there are smaller companies. Wolf Industries is one. There's one out in Goldendale. They do small one-off kind of things. I'm not sure if they have interest to scale up to do something more that is more like manufacturing. But there are companies in place today that could start this work.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'd add that the state of Oregon has made equity investments in both modular and manufacturing housing plants in the last few years, which is another financing model to look at. The state of Colorado has created all kinds of incentive programs for modular housing. And they have a very interesting group out there called Fading West Development that is implementing a lot of really interesting manufacturing processes, and they're interested in expanding. And Aaron knows of quite a few companies. So there are a lot of groups out there that I think if you created the environment would be very interested. And if you want to learn more, someone suggested that I mention the paper that we did for the Bipartisan Policy Center. So if you just Googled Bipartisan Policy Center and my last name, Lubell, you would come up with it. It's a paper about offsite construction. Oh, there you go. Using economies of scale to produce starter homes. And it's a sort of a primer on some of these ideas about risk and how to set up systems that would facilitate modular housing.
Thank you.
Sir.
Hello, John Eliason from King County Housing Authority. I think my grandfather, maybe my great-grandfather, bought a Craftsman home out of the Craftsman catalog. So
The
we
Sears,
can do this.
right? Sears,
You know,
absolutely.
we can. One of the things I was really sad about is that during the downturn of 2008, we had a program when I worked at Quadrant where we worked with our architects for advanced framing. We brought, I believe it was Woodinville lumber in, and we manufactured panels right at the lumberyard, and they were square. Everything was really great. And working with the architect, they were all in dimensional lumber, so minimum waste. And these panels came out, and they were such that 2 people could lift them, no problem. And so we'd basically frame an entire 2,400 square foot home in 3 days. The pieces would come out as they were needed as well. So there wasn't all the construction, oh my gosh, you know, you got to spend a bunch of money. They'd come out and they were paid for as they came. But it had everything to do with the architecture, the ability to have the limited amount of waste and the advanced framing so those things could be really lightweight but still lifted onto the truck. So I just wanted to mention that because that's kind of part way from what we're talking about. We looked at modular in a couple of projects and unfortunately we couldn't make it pencil. But what we did do to try to work with that, we worked with Walsh Construction and Synergy Construction both, and we had everything pre-cut and ordered in time. And the same thing working with the architects, having them be all dimensional lumber such that minimum waste in the factory happened. So these frames went up really fast because as they came out, it was like a kit of parts. Here's this. It wasn't modular, but it was a step in the right direction. But I wanted Grace to just talk about that because these barriers are the real codes, like modulation. The jurisdiction wants them 5 feet. You know, the room width or whatever. If you can make them dimensional lumber, and the architects really think about the advanced framing and dimensional lumber, that could make a huge difference in waste and cost. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we're talking about the productization. If we can get standard units that architects and developers all agree that we're going to use these building blocks, then I think that's an easy place to go. Yeah.
Hi, yes. Ela T. Schmidt, Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle. I'm their asset manager. I have a question for you guys. Have you guys ever heard of A-Frame? The company A-Frame? It's a company that produces A-frame homes, and they're essentially like modular homes, but they actually can build it on site within like a month. And it's basically all the products come from a manufacturer, and you kind of can select different things, but basically it's the same standardized home, and the price is actually more beneficial and fiscally conservative when you think about it, because you're creating the same structure like a modular home over and over and over and over. You're getting all of your supplies and products from this manufacturer, but they can actually build it on site, and it's actually fiscally conservative and more efficient. So if you have a different site, or let's say you're buying land here and there, well, each land, as we know, it's going to equate for different things, whether the land needs to be leveled, etc., right? Or if you have to remove things off of that land, it actually is beneficial and is standardized like a modular home, but it's an actual amazing company, and I suggest you guys look it up. It's A-Vrame, V-R-A-M-E, but I think it could be essential because they're amazing homes. And you can get one between $75,000 to $200,000, depending on what you need, but there's a standardized process.
And that sounds a lot like what happens in Japan. For anybody to go buy a home, you can go to a couple of companies that do manufacturing, and you can select all your things, like you're picking the options on your car, and then 40 days later you can be walking into your brand new constructed home.
I think what other countries have done and what's happened in Japan, like in the US, generally that market is high end. So generally that market is if you have land and you have money, then you've got lots of choices. If you want to have it built off-site, built on-site, you can do all kinds of things. Very little to no options for the middle or below. So that's a big problem with the housing ladder.
So we have tons of questions. It's fantastic and great to see everybody staying to the end here. I want to read one of the questions. I want to see if we can get to these questions real quick. So if we could, just quick answers. Disruptions to the supply chain continue to impact construction. How is the exposure to supply chain risk different for offsite versus onsite construction? What are the advantages to offsite construction?
Well, I'll talk to manufacturing more than offsite. In manufacturing, ideally, you're building just in time, which is very difficult for materials supply chain and construction, because construction material supply chain builds by project. So send all the thing to the site, build the stuff on the site, get paid for all the stuff, etc. In manufacturing, you want things showing up so that you have as little amount of inventory on your shelves as possible, because you're trying to allocate as much of your capacity to building things and not to storing materials. What that lends itself to is very different supply chain relationships, which are just-in-time supply chain relationships, which have different contracting mechanisms, and a lot of times longer term. Like you can commit to, as a factory, if I know my year or my multi-year, I wait until the price is in the right spot and I lock in and I purchase. And I'm not purchasing for one project, I'll purchase for multiple projects, because I know I use the same thing over and over and over again. So there are efficiencies. So you can, it's actually a hedge. It's more efficient for the manufacturer to purchase than it is for a project, because when the project comes and the financing's there, you got to buy. And so the risk there is you pro forma it here, and then it changed, and now you got a problem.
Great, thank you. Please.
Hey guys, Nick Coelho, Linwood City Council. I'm one of those many hapless newly electeds that kind of got thrust into the deep end of that swimming pool known as the housing affordability crisis. And it's great because a lot of us are trying to solve problems and innovate and are really just reaching for any ideas out there. But there is that risk of innovation splintering kind of the regulatory pool. And the message I'm hearing here is standardization and regularity is important. And so from the perspective of modular housing, what is more important, like innovating and reforming land use and permit processes and things like that, or really just aligning ourselves with neighboring jurisdictions to create that uniformity?
So it's important to think about what we mean by uniformity. So what we need to make manufacturing work is a standardized product that can work in multiple jurisdictions. That doesn't mean your zoning needs to look the same as other people's. It just needs to be that product is going to work in your jurisdiction and it's going to work in the other jurisdictions. So I would encourage you to liberalize your zoning as much as possible to facilitate construction, particularly because we can't wait for these products. But definitely think about how your product, how standardized products will work and fit, and make sure they fit. And don't try to do a lot of things that are one-off, particularly around the building codes, because that makes it really hard for, a statewide operation to place homes in your area.
I'll flip it around. Sorry, go ahead, Grace. You have something to say?
Well, I was just going to say that that just because we're using a standard product doesn't mean that the final outcome is going to be the same. The way that those Lego pieces are constructed and assembled together is going to be different if the building is 200 feet long or 500 feet long or 50 feet wide, right? And so there's still going to be opportunity for the architects to be creative with the exterior design. So don't think you're going to get a Soviet-style housing block on every site that gets a modular project.
And I would just flip it around in the other direction, which would be, don't worry about the innovation. I mean, that's the market's job, is to figure out innovation, to figure out different ways of doing things. But the way a factory will view your problem, the way we viewed places that we would work or not work, places that are difficult to deal with, I can't. You know what I mean? It's too much. There's too much risk already. And so like you look at the Bay Area, you can decide as a factory, you can decide to dedicate 6 months to a year to building out a project with a development partner that you've got in Palo Alto or Redwood City, right? Palo Alto is just everything gets slowed down, shut down, lawsuits, everything. Redwood City has paved the way. They said, we want housing. We've moved all the things out of the way. They're not far from each other. But everybody knows, everybody on the other side of it knows like how difficult it's going to be to build in one place versus the other. And that goes into decision making about like, where do you want to bring this innovative product? Who's going to support you? Who's working with you versus who's working against you?
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Last question here.
Sure.
Last but not least.
Hello, my name is Jeannie Williams, and I'm from the Skyway Coalition in King County, Seattle. And I actually have two questions. My first question is really around we are a community that are identifying all of our needs for our affordable housing of different levels, home ownership, rental, all kinds of stuff. And we really want to make sure that we're looking at all the models. And modular has been one of the ones that we've identified as a certain sector of our housing that we want to do. So from a community perspective, what would you recommend that we kind of begin to do and begin to look at and begin to approach in order to kind of be one of those places that the community is interested in the modular model? And then how do we start to get involved and bring that to our community, for one? And then my second question is that, Grace, you mentioned earlier, you kind of touched a little bit on financing, and we talked about financing from the building perspective, but what about from the people perspective? Because you approach a bank and they think that you know, a modular home is something that maybe not investable. So from a community perspective, then how do we come and start to work on the financing for that for our community members?
Yep. 1 minute left. Okay, and maybe I can answer some more detailed questions afterwards. But I would say, in a nutshell, I think starting to articulate that vision for what you want to create. So talk with an architect, or try to find a developer who's also interested in building in modular, and start to create that vision so that you have, you know, things to talk with council members about, different funders, and also for the community to understand that these aren't mobile homes, that these are going to be homes like anything else that's built on site. And I think the other piece was financing. Also trying to talk with local banks to find out who would be interested and willing to loan on these properties once they're built. Once they're built, they're going to be like any other construction project that happens. But I'm happy to talk to you more.
Well, great. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists here. And thank you all for your interest, and I hope you continue to be interested in this topic. Thank you.